A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of The Horrible Deplorable. I am The Horrible Deplorable, Matt Wingard, and with me is my very good friend Doris. Doris, how are you doing?
Just great. It's good to be with you today.
Doris doesn't like it when I call her the mayor, but that's kind of my nickname for her. And she's just giving me a look right now. I want to first of all say hello to all the Gabbers out there. We're big fans of being on Gab. We run the daily news update on Gab. I know a lot of you follow that, and we thank you for that and provide comments and feedback. We do read them all. And this is going to be, we hope, a weekly program, kind of a news and review, but we also want to throw in a lot of philosophy and history and the rest, and everything will be focused on Trump and what a seminal historical figure I think he is in American history. We're going to talk a lot about what he's done, what he's doing, what he's going to do, and how we can support him. This is the show for all the other Trumpers out there so that you know you are not alone. You are not alone, and we're going to talk more about all of that as we go through our hour today. We're gonna, in the beginning shows, probably gonna have to define some terms along the way. You're gonna get used to me saying some things, and so I want to define them as I go. The very first and most important is liberal commanding heights. Those of you who follow me on Twitter or on Gab know that I use this abbreviation LCH a lot because you don't get a lot of characters on the apps, and it stands for liberal commanding heights. What are the liberal commanding heights? Well, those are academia, Hollywood, and the mainstream media. That's the liberal commanding heights. And this was something that Andrew Breitbart talked a lot about. And it's this idea that the culture is controlled by these entities, not only in this country, but because we're such an important country in the world, they're very influential worldwide as well. So they control the culture, and they control what we call the narrative. Many of you now know from the Trump campaign and have learned what the narrative is. And the narrative is sort of the accepted wisdom. It's the story. It's the arc of history, as the Clinton-Obama types like to say. It bends towards them. Well, it bends towards them because they have control of the narrative. And they get to decide who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And they get to decide what's important, what gets emphasized, and what is either so unimportant that it doesn't even get mentioned, or that perhaps it only gets mentioned once, and then they'll spend 10 times as much effort on the things that they believe are important. Doris and I have talked about this a lot. It can be, for instance, something that the New York Times cares about is on page A1. And then it's on page A1 again, and maybe it's on page A1 10 more times. And it's not so much that they will ignore news or things that we think are important, but they may cover that on A15 once, on a Saturday, and then move on and never come back to it again. So it is the ability to pick and choose, to emphasize, and to decide what is important, what is the American story, where should we be going, where have we come from, and who the good guys and the bad guys are, as I said. So that's all part of the power of the liberal commanding heights. And so that leads me into this idea of, who is, we know that these three, academia and Hollywood and the mainstream media, are liberal or left of center. And so how does that translate? There was a book years and years ago, David Halberstam wrote a book called The Powers That Be, and he was writing about the major newspapers and magazines of the time. And he he did it by chapter, and he talked about the families that owned those entities and who they were and what they believed. And it was very clear if you read the book that who they were and what they believed ultimately filtered into what that newspaper or magazine covered and what they fought for and what the editorial page hammered away at. And so he talked about Henry Luce in Time magazine, and he talked about the Chandler family that at the time owned the Los Angeles Times, and even the Grahams that owned the Washington Post. If you read that book, the takeaway was clear that it matters who owns and controls a media outlet. We've come to understand that much better now. But of course, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, who absolutely loathes President Trump and has set aside a whole staff at the Washington Post whose whole job is just to harass and write negative pieces about the President of the United States. And he's just about to become the richest man in the world. He's going to surpass, Doris, he's going to surpass Bill Gates here shortly as the richest man in the world.
Wow, Amazon is taking over.
And you have Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world, billionaire out of Mexico, who's a major owner of the New York Times. So it's no coincidence the New York Times then takes positions on immigration and on the wall that are contrary to the president, very, very angry at the president. And Fox News. Fox News is a good example, closer to home. We've all seen this now in the last couple of years. Rupert Murdoch hired Roger Ailes to create that station, and it reflected Rupert, who's an Australian, his sort of maverick view of kind of going against the grain to create a media empire. He understood there was a need that needed to be filled on the conservative side of the spectrum, and he filled it. Now, he has, over the last couple of years, been turning the Fox News channel over to his two sons, who run in liberal circles and social justice warrior circles in New York, and they're much more connected in that way to the elites and what the narrative is and what the conventional wisdom is. They're much more interested, having been born into wealth, in running among wealthy people and fitting in and in that cocktail circuit, not, ostracizing themselves.
And so Fox News has become something we're not really in favor of anymore.
Right. You can see the transition in Fox News as they've let Bill O'Reilly go and some other people behind the scenes who actually were making editorial decisions at the station. It's no surprise, again, once you understand who owns the outfit. So always stay focused on that. We're recording this shortly after the events at London Bridge in the UK. Ironically, they had just had an attack in Manchester, and all the sort of same lefties and social justice warriors had done the sort of hashtag pray for, genuflexing, symbolic gesturing that, love is the answer. Ariana Grande is going to do this concert. Of course, she's going to be ringed by steel, and it's going to be very difficult. They're going to have hyper security. They're going to build a wall around this concert of love, but I guess that's a wall that they're in favor of. And in the midst of all of this sort of pretend, along the lines of the Muslim mayor of London saying, terrorism is just something we have to live with, boom, they get hit again. 7 dead. Over 46 injured. These guys come in a van running people over and then spill out of the van cutting throats with knives before authorities shoot them dead. It's all over in about 8 minutes. I read online someone say, the response was so rapid. They were there and they shot them dead within 8 minutes. And I thought, yeah, but if you include the immigration policy that allowed those folks and their families to immigrate in and to not assimilate and to ultimately become radicalized and murderous, it wasn't that rapid a response, actually. It was kind of a slow fuse that they never really addressed, and they're still not addressing. Doris, I know you were mortified by what you saw yesterday.
Oh, it just doesn't seem to get any better, and so many radicals have been allowed into these countries that the countries are losing control of their own country.
We're all seeing it, and this is part of what Trump tapped into. This is, I've told Doris this, she knows this many times. I've been a fan of Trump's from very early on in the campaign. He opened my eyes to a lot of things, too. We're going to talk about all of this on this show, but, when he came out and I have believed for some time that immigration is a key and central issue for people right of center. If you don't understand how immigration is actually changing the politics of the country in a leftward direction, then you're not really in the fight, because it's a deliberate strategy and it has shifted the politics to the left in this country, and it's continuing to do that. When Trump came out and sort of in his initial announcement made his statements about the wall and about Mexican immigration and immigration in general, I thought, wow, somebody who's actually saying it. But then, he was immediately losing business. Very quickly lost about $200 million in business. And I thought, well, that's the end. He won't last very long. But he stuck to his guns, and he refused to budge. And, just within a matter of a week or two, he took a shot at John McCain, who's one of the D.C. swamp creatures. And we'll talk a lot more about John McCain as time goes on. But he took a shot at him and got away with it. At the time, I thought, now the whole elites are turning on him again. He can't keep doing this and surviving. But within a couple of days, when it was clear that he wasn't going to apologize and that he wasn't fazed by the backlash and he was going to move on, I realized that not only could this guy win the nomination, this is way back in September, but that he would win the nomination and had a very good shot at becoming president of the United States. So I was on board at that point. Doris, your thoughts on Trump?
I thought at first, too, that the things he was saying were just too outrageous. But the problem is they had such this ring of truth. Then that is what the public responded to.
Folks, if you haven't already sort of processed this, I hope you will keep in mind that you are living in very historical times. Trump is one of the most important figures in American history. Time will absolutely prove that. So hold on to the trinkets and the merchandise and the collector's items, and take notes, keep a diary, go to rallies and take pictures, document this, because it is going to be very important to future generations. They're going to find all of this very, very interesting. It's a crucial period, and this man is transformative because he says the things that we know are true, and he doesn't back down. I want to go back to the point about him losing all that business. Not since our founding fathers really has the leadership in this country. Well, you could maybe include Lincoln because of the Civil War. But it's been a long time since we've had leadership in which they really had something on the line, in which they were really at risk. For many, many decades now, win or lose, everybody involved in this game of politics has come out ahead. People who run for president and lose, they still get to increase their speaking fees afterwards, and they write books, and they're feted everywhere, and it is a net plus to run for president, whether you win or lose. Look at Al Gore, who became a multi-millionaire on the climate hoaxing issue after losing a race for the president. John Kerry became Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, and they've gotten very, very rich, and she will continue to do well financially, even though she lost. Trump is the first person in your lifetime to actually take financial and personal hits. If he had lost last November, he would have been in a far worse position, both financially and personally and socially, than he was before he started the campaign. And that's what makes him such a great man and a great historical figure, is that he actually put something at risk. Our founders, when they signed the Declaration, remember they had that phrase of we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Well, no one's done that in a long time, but Donald Trump absolutely put himself at risk for the things that he believed in and for this country. And I know that many of you, as I was very, very proud on election night when he won. Doris remembers that I was screaming at the top of my lungs. I was so happy. Happy that he won because he should have won, because the issues were right, because change was possible, because it was such a historic moment. It seemed so impossible. Never in our history, never in our 230 some odd years of history as a country, have all the elites, or 90% plus more of the elites in this country, all been on one side of a presidential campaign. And it wasn't Donald Trump's side. And yet we defeated collectively the elites in this country. And we're continuing. He is, with our help, continuing to defeat the elites in this country. And it is absolutely amazing. It is historical. And I'm trying to keep notes. Some of you who follow me on thedailystir.com know that for a while I was doing a POTUS diary where every week I was just posting all the things they managed to get done week by week, and all the vicious attacks and fake news that's been coming at them as well. That's been a little bit difficult for me to stay on top of as a weekly chore, but certainly the first 100 and 125, 130 days are there, and a lot of really interesting things.
Oh, my favorite was the list you made of all of the names that the left has called Trump.
Yes, for the first 6 months or so of the campaign, I kept a running tally of the worst things they were saying about him with links to it, just as a kind of a growing list. I could have kept that list going, but it was really more the same thing. Once you've called him Hitler and Stalin and the devil, and there isn't much more other than just to continue repeating yourself. But all the best stuff was there. It was so hyperbolic, so over the top. But, this is another important point to talk about and why we've been losing. And I want to talk in detail about why it feels like we've been losing for such a long time and who's responsible for that, right? So the left is never going to compromise. And that's one of the first lessons you have to learn if you're going to be involved in politics. The left never compromises. What they do is take a partial loaf and then vow to come back for the rest later. But it's always forward gains, forward momentum for the left. A lot of people say, well, you have to compromise. You have to compromise in the legislative process. And that's true. You do. But there is a difference between a compromise in which both sides are holding their nose, or both sides are getting something they want. Both sides are having to give something they don't want to have to give. And what the left has been doing for 100 years, which is more akin to the man who shows up in the alley with a gun and tells you he wants all the money in your wallet. And you say, well, I've got $100, but I need some of this. Let's compromise. I'll give you 50 and I'll keep 50. And he says, fine. He takes your 50, you leave. And when you walk around the corner, there he is again with his gun saying, I want all the money in your wallet. And by this constant series of compromises, you end up with nothing, and he ends up with it all. He never really gives anything, even though it seems like it did, because he says, I wanted 100 and I only took 50. That is what the left has been doing for 100 years. And, for a long time I thought, as a former Republican elected official myself, I thought, well, we're just terrible negotiators. That's what it is. We're just electing people that are really bad negotiators. But I have come to understand, and Trump helped a lot with this, that there is this whole elite entity, which I have called, or I didn't call it this, I'm sure I read this online, Conservative Inc., right? Conservative Inc. I think it came from VDare. And that is all of these people in the conservative movement who make money no matter what, right? So they write columns, the Krauthammers, the George Wills, the Jonah Goldbergs, and, you read the columns and you think, oh, yes, I totally agree. They're so brilliant. But they write the column and then they cash the check and then they move on. Whether or not those ideas ever actually win the day, they still make a very good living. All these Republicans that we've elected in D.C., they give these great speeches about how they're fighting for us. But they collect big salaries, nice benefits. They get to be called congressman and senator and live very nice elite lives, even if the Democrats are in control. Or even if they're in control, but they just can't get it all done with excuse after excuse after excuse. The think tanks, who, take Cato, for instance, that pushes the hard libertarian. Do they actually win the day? No, but they're sticking to their principles, and so give us another $50, right? So they're all fundraising off of our desire to win, our belief in these principles, but they don't actually put anything at risk. Right? Win or lose, they're all living great lives, getting paid, and that is Conservative Inc., this industry of folks who sort of preach to us and get the hallelujahs from us and certainly separate us from money in our wallets, but don't ever deliver. decade after decade after decade. Now, I had some experience with this. I served in the Oregon State Legislature and finally got to be involved in these negotiations. We had a tie in the House. It was about 30-30. Well, it wasn't about, it was 30-30. And if that seems like it would be a difficult process, it was. Ultimately, my argument to the leadership on my side when we were behind closed doors was, look, we're going to have to give them something we don't want to give them, right? I mean, if we want them to give us something they don't want to give us, we're going to have to hold our nose and vote for unpleasant things our voters aren't going to be happy about. But the argument we need to be able to make is that we got something that they didn't want to vote for, that causes trouble for them with their voters, that they had to hold their nose, so that's a real compromise. And Doris watched this whole process. She's known me for some time, and she was there when all of this was going on.
The whole thing with defeating the teachers union and getting education reform in this state is simply due to all of the work that you did.
Right. So as an example, the Obamacare had passed. That was not something at the Oregon State Legislature that we could do anything about. And the Democrats wanted to set up an exchange, which the law allowed. And my argument was, okay, let's give them the votes they need to create the exchange, but what are we going to get in return? And ultimately, what we settled on was some pretty impressive education reform, stuff that the teachers union absolutely did not want, was livid when Democrats supplied the votes to pass open enrollment in the state, to expand the charter school law, to allow more enrollment in charter schools. We did some really, really important things that could never have happened with Republican votes alone. It was not possible. And we had a governor who, was willing to sign off on the compromise because he was getting some things that he wanted. Those are the kind of compromises that I never see out of D.C., right? Even though they control the House and the Senate, I never see them sitting down and saying, well, look, we had to give on this, but here's what we got. Or when they come out and claim, here's what we got the ability to sell oil overseas. It's like, really, you traded away everything the Democrats wanted so that some oil companies could sell overseas? That's not core bedrock stuff, That's not the kind of thing that's going to be impressive to voters. So for a long time, I thought they were lousy negotiators, but I have come to believe that there are a lot of people there that are happy just to sell us out. They really are. They make a good living. John McCain, I don't want to name any names, but John McCain. And there are people who just make a good living off of being there. And sure, they'll give the speech, and maybe to some extent they believe in the principles, but it's really just more important to be important and to remain important. And I do think, though, there are a number of Republicans who ultimately don't agree. They give us lip service in their speeches, but they ultimately don't agree. They don't think it's going to happen, or they don't think it should happen.
Well, they go in with a defeatist attitude, like they don't really believe it can. So they kind of give it a half-hearted effort.
Absolutely. So I want to go back to this point about the left never compromises and the unpleasantness of the fighting. One of the things that's happened with Donald Trump is he fights, and when they push back and push back hard, he digs in and he punches back. And, for the last year and a half, I've been listening to people who either voted for him or couldn't quite bring themselves to vote for him, but are on our side, they say, whining about tactics and manners, what I call Queensberry's rules, right? It's sort of the Bill Kristol view that if this is the way we have to fight to win, then I'd rather lose. Really, like the British, marching in their red coats while we were shooting from the trees. Who won that war? We did. Now, they complained bitterly that we weren't fighting according to gentlemen's rules, but they lost. And we won. And I think we've learned ever since World War II that, when you don't fight a war, when you try to fight a war with rules, when the other side's not fighting with rules, you don't end up winning. Who wants it more? Wars are battles of will. Political wars are battles of will. And this Queensberry's rules has really been detrimental. And Trump has thrown them out and said, look, I'm going to fight like they fight. And they've been winning, so why wouldn't I use their tactics? And there is this segment on our side that recoils at that and cannot bring themselves to be a party to that. That's a loser's mentality. I'm sorry, but that is just the reality. I've said for many years that politics is war without weapons. I mean, in every way, when you're discussing sort of why war works and how people win and how dirty it can be, and that's what politics is like. I've been in it. I know. The only thing that doesn't happen is actual weaponry, used against each other. But in every other way, it's just like war. And you cannot win if you're going to hold yourself to a bunch of rules that your enemy is not, or your opponent is not holding themselves to. And we have to accept that. But that also means accepting that it's uncomfortable. I hear a lot of people complain that, we're so divided in this country. We are only divided in this country because the right side of the spectrum is finally fighting, and fighting like the left. And when both sides are fighting like the left, basically take no prisoners attitude, it's really uncomfortable. It's really unpleasant. For many years, we've lost because in order to create peace and harmony, Republicans, or people on the right side of the aisle, have compromised, but not in the compromise we were talking about, the good ones, the giving the $50 out of your wallet to make the robber go away, to buy peace and tranquility, and to make the mobs and the protests go away. But as you've seen, they just come back. So my argument is that the unpleasantness and the nastiness is a sign that we're actually achieving something. It's a sign that we're actually engaged in this war. It's a sign that we have a chance of winning something, of actually making gains. Because when the left is quiet, it's because they're getting their way. When they are crying at the top of their lungs, when they're gathered in groups protesting, when they've become unhinged, when you see this Trump derangement syndrome everywhere, that's because he's effective. It's because he's actually doing really real things, like pulling out of the climate accord. And that drives them crazy. They're never just going to shake our hand and say, well, job well done, you defeated us. They're never going to do it, folks. So if we're going to be involved, if we're going to be engaged, if we're going to fight, you've got to know that it's a long-term battle, and you've got to know that it will be uncomfortable. Matter of fact, that's how you know that it's working. If it starts to feel like it's calm again and that everybody's getting along, check your wallet. We're probably losing. Things are probably going against us. I'm sorry, but that is the reality with the left. They are only calm when they're getting their way. When they're agitated and unhappy, it's because they're either not getting their way or they're afraid they're not about to get their way. And so this is just the new reality that Trump has basically exposed for us. He's shown us how to win when you're outnumbered and overwhelmed and the entire elite and liberal commanding heights is against you. He won. We won with him, but only by engaging full on in the way that the left does. So, a good example of this sort of conservative ink, right? In the last week, John Boehner came out and said, the presidency's been a disaster, right? This guy was Speaker of the House. He was supposed to be leading our movement. And when we get the most effective right-of-center president we've had in my lifetime, and yes, that includes Reagan, John Boehner is saying it's a disaster. It's only a disaster because he's uncomfortable at what he sees, right? He's used to being, when he was there and when he was speaker, there was a lot of handshaking and back patting and people getting along. And now, the press is on fire, totally, going nuts. The elites are all really, really pissed. And he looks at all of that turmoil and he sees world leaders not happy with Trump and he says, oh, it's a disaster. And that's what I'm trying to point out to you, is that too many people on our side who are supposed to be leading us are looking to create calm. Because that's good for them. When you make a very good living and you're the congressman or the Speaker of the House, you kind of want things to be calm because life's good. You're one of the elites. Too many people and on our side in leadership are uncomfortable with the battle, with the unpleasantness, with the fight, and they need to go. Trump was pulling out of the climate accord, and Romney texts he tweets that he was against that move, right? This was the guy we nominated for president of the United States last time.
Well, that was a mistake last time.
Right, but what do we know now? We know now that he would never have done what Trump has done, and yet he is perceived as the more conservative one, right? I said from very early on, you can go back on the Daily Stir and look at the things that I wrote, Trump will be a more conservative president, or he'll accomplish more for conservatives than any of the so-called conservative candidates. I've never argued that Trump is personally the most conservative person to run. But I think a lot of Christians and certainly conservative folks are realizing that you don't necessarily need to pick people on just how conservative they are, but you should be picking them on how effective they are at actually getting things done. And I knew from early on that this was a guy who fights to win, hates to lose. And so if he just did half the things he was promising to do, that would be a heck of a lot more than most conservatives ever accomplish. People like Ted Cruz, who a lot of people like because he says all the right things, but what does he actually accomplish? What's actually accomplished? Even if Ted Cruz is, and I don't actually agree that this is true, but assume for the sake of argument that Ted Cruz is 5 times more personally conservative than Trump, and that if he were president, he would have fought. Well, first of all, he didn't win, and he probably wouldn't have won, right? Trump won, and he's actually getting things done, and he's getting things done faster. Matter of fact, to the extent that we're frustrated that things aren't getting done, it's from the Congress, right? The people who are supposedly more conservative than him, and they're not actually getting it done. This is all eye-opening stuff, and we have to see it and acknowledge it. John McCain and the swamp, the difference between D.C. Republicans and Democrats, right? So I think that a lot of people there do have things they believe in. But, of course, it's easier to be a Democrat because they have the liberal commanding heights. Everything seems to be moving in their direction. They can afford, when they're out of power, to bide their time a little bit till they're back in. The bureaucracy is certainly not out of power, and that's still something that they control. Republicans, when they're out, right? And when they're in, they may be out soon. So, a lot of Republicans have, especially in D.C., have either fallen into an elite trap where they've just gotten so used to the perks they don't want to give that up, and that's sort of more important than actually putting anything at risk. Or they have sort of got Stockholm syndrome, where they just, it's so punishing that, most of them look at what happened to Trump, and I think internally they know that they could never survive. They mentally just feel like they could never survive that media onslaught. I'm not convinced that I personally could have done that as a politician, right? And so when they look and see how they tried to gut him on a daily basis, and yet he persevered, I think a lot of them look and have over decades, I couldn't survive that. So they cave, John McCain has been sucking up to the mainstream press in D.C. for decades. Partly, I think, out of, frankly, just selling out, but I think also because he's not that bright, and I think he figured on, when he first got to Congress, he was embroiled in the Abscam bribery scandal, which he barely survived. And I think, he got a taste of what the media can do when they really bear down on you, and decided very early on that he was going to suck up to them and, be an anonymous source to them and all of that to try to curry favor, because he never really wanted to have that blinding, spotlight on himself. And there are a lot of people in D.C. who work defensively like that.
And very few that have the courage to stand up and say, I believe in President Trump.
Right, or they do it because now, of course, he's been elected, or they thought, they do it when it's convenient to them. But of course, one of the things that's important in politics is to stop listening to the flowery words in the presentation and actually look at what people are accomplishing. What do they really get done? We need more warriors like Trump, and some take no prisoners fighters. Not necessarily absolutists. It's not about necessarily, I'm not for or against the Freedom Caucus, but I'm going to use them as an example. It's not necessarily forming a caucus that says we're just not going to vote for anything and we're going to grind this to a halt. It's about, okay, how much power do you actually have, to influence things? And then can you get a deal that's commensurate with that power? If you're the Freedom Caucus, you can't grind the whole government to a halt till you get everything you want. But you can stop the process for one thing, right? You can decide what's one thing that we absolutely have to have. That's the kind of thing that would make our side feel like we accomplished something, and we can go back and say, yeah, I voted for the budget, I voted for this stuff, but in exchange for this very important thing, and I don't see those kinds of concessions being extracted. We have a lot of lousy negotiators. I got a call from the RNC, a fundraising call, looking for money the other day, and I just told them flat out, until I see the Congress actually passing the president's agenda, you're not going to get a dime from me. It's not going to happen. And they, continued to try to move through their script and get me to donate, but it's not going to happen. A lot of what you see in D.C., because again, we have to remember Trump's not as much a Republican as he is sort of an American first nationalist. He has sort of started a new party, if you think about it. But because our two-party system is so strong in this country, it has to kind of be done within one of the existing parties. But a lot of Republicans in D.C. sort of see themselves as Republicans and Trump as something else. So they're very happy to support his conservative, the elements of his agenda that are conservative. When he nominates Gorsuch, they're all happy about that, yay for the Supreme Court. But on trade and on, draining the swamp, things that are not necessarily as conservative, much more nationalist, you can see that they're slow walking it or they're trying to block it. A good example is the healthcare bill. I think a lot of conservatives would just like to see the Obamacare repealed, right?
Right.
But there aren't the votes to do that. Everybody in D.C. understands that there are not enough votes to do that. The Senate's too tricky, and you got people like Olympia Snowe from Maine, who barely holds on to her seat there. She cannot afford to be as conservative as Cornyn in Texas. The votes aren't there. The president never promised to just repeal Obamacare. He promised to repeal and replace. It has to be replaced with something, and it has to be replaced with something that can get the votes. I was not happy with the Freedom Caucus for grinding it to a halt, but ultimately they got a concession, and they made the bill more conservative, and then they got behind the bill. Now, I doubt when it goes through the Senate and comes back that it's going to be that conservative, so they're going to get tested again. But the president is not as conservative on these kinds of things. He's much more nationalist in this, taking care of people, but Americans first, and it's not always going to be a conservative agenda. And so we're going to have to keep our eye on the folks in D.C. because I don't think they really care whether he gets a second term. And, ultimately they're the ones that are really in trouble because a lot of them are up for re-election in 2018 and he is not. So I have been, if you've been following me on Gab, I've been saying that they're the ones that have to show some significant accomplishments. They need to repeal and replace the healthcare bill. They need to pass the tax reform, and they need to pass the infrastructure bill. They've got to do all of those things before they face the voters in a year and a half. And time's running out because next year gets more difficult. In a political year when the campaigns are actually up and running and they have a Democrat on the ballot against them running ads, it's much more difficult to vote, to take hard votes. This was the year to get at least 3 of those 4 things done, and they are not on track to get it done. And it's going to cost them, right? When I worked for a congressman in 2000 when Bush won, and they had the House and the Senate. And I remember saying to him at the time, you guys should do everything you can in the first 2 years, because historically, the in party loses a lot of seats in that off-year election, that one that was coming up in 2002. And I said, don't depend on the fact that you will have total control of the government in 2 years. Assume you won't, and try to get as much done as possible so that even if you're thrown out of office, you've got these great list of things you actually got done. Well, they slow-walked it. It turned out that with 9/11 and the war, Republicans actually picked up seats in 2002, so they didn't actually lose power until 2006. But I think, you were all there, you all watched that. What made us all angry, and me as well, is to have 6 years of control and to accomplish so little. And when you think about it, they did nothing. They did nothing as far as a significant gain for the right side of the aisle that changed the playing field. They did nothing. And that's part of where that welling of anger had started, where it started, ultimately then leading to the Tea Party, and then after that to the Trump election. Republicans have got to start producing, and I don't think enough people in D.C. have figured that out. So why is the immigration issue so important, right? We talked about that at the top. Well, the reality of immigration is that it changes the politics. You cannot take 1 million people from Guatemala and assume that those 1 million people are going to vote exactly the same proportionally as the Americans who are already here. The truth is that 1 million people from Guatemala are going to probably vote Democrat. And we have the statistics to back this up. I mean, people can throw around words like racist all they want. Facts are facts. The way people vote by ethnicity is tracked. It's been tracked for decades. And you can repeat the experiment enough to know that it's basically a fact of life that third world immigrants are going to vote for the Democrats somewhere around 75% to 90%, right? Your best case scenario, if you break out all the ethnicities and you look, your best case scenario is to sometimes get 25%. Worst case scenario is 10%, right? This is a deliberate strategy on the part of the Democrats to, as Steve Saylor would say over at VDare, to import a new people. They're just unhappy with the way Americans vote, so they are going to import people that will vote the way they want them to. That's an existential threat to anybody who cares about issues on the right side of the aisle. If you're conservative, if you're pro the Constitution, if you're libertarian, the craziest thing out there I see is libertarians who are open borders libertarians. If you actually believe in the well, let me put it a different way. I suppose if you just want to believe in the principle, but you don't care that it never actually is implemented, then that would explain most libertarians, I guess. But if the point of politics is to actually put into practice your principles, then an open borders immigration policy makes libertarianism impossible. The immigrants who are coming into this country will not vote for libertarianism, right? So it's one thing to have a set of principles, but the art of politics is understanding how to get from the purity of your principles to actually implementing something. How do I actually make this the law of the land so that I'm actually living under the principles that I think the country should be run by? And that requires some compromise, And for libertarians, the open borders aspect of their philosophy makes all of the other aspects of their philosophy impossible. So at some point you have to decide between the two. Is the open borders policy the most important part of my overall libertarian policy? Or are these other things about less government, lower taxes, more individual freedom, is that sort of the core of my philosophy? And if it is, you've got to change your tune on the open borders part, or you're just selling yourself out. It's impossible. So, I figured out a couple of years ago that this immigration issue was an existential threat to the conservative / libertarian / right of center movement. Ann Coulter came along and wrote her great book, Adios America, which Trump obviously had read, and it influenced him, making all of these same points. And if you haven't read it, I certainly invite you to. Mark Stein's been talking about this for over a decade. And so, this is really the key issue for me with Trump, and the thing that I've decided basically to give him a year. I'm not really going to evaluate his immigration policy until I've given him a year to put his people in place, to get things up and running, because it takes time with the bureaucracy and in D.C. to turn things around. I'm certainly not happy with some of the things I've read about refugee numbers going up. I see the ICE arrests on a weekly basis, and they need another 0 on the end of them as far as I'm concerned. I mean, he's going to have to ratchet up deportations to have a really significant effect on illegal immigration. So I'm watching, but I'm withholding judgment until Thanksgiving, Christmas, when I want to look back and sort of see what has been accomplished as far as it comes to building the wall and ending illegal immigration and the legal immigration, the H-1B visas and the rest. So I see conflicting reports. Sometimes it looks like they're ratcheting this stuff down. Sometimes there are, Chicken Little stories out there saying that no, it's going in the opposite direction. But time will tell, and we'll have a pretty good idea by the end of the year whether they're actually accomplishing this or not. Going back to this idea of the liberal commanding heights, right, and the narrative. So it comes out a couple weeks ago that Obama was involved in sanctioning a whole bunch of domestic spying, illegal domestic spying, during his administration, right? And we've also seen a story in the last couple of weeks that the Democrats in the House had a huge intelligence breach. They'd hired some folks to handle all of their IT work, and those folks were downloading everything, and one guy's run off to Pakistan, right? Huge scandal, huge breach, right? And then on the other side, you have this totally phony issue of Trump connected to Russia and he's some kind of Russian agent and all this other BS, right? Look at what the liberal commanding heights can do, right? There's been one or two stories on those Democrat scandals, and then they kind of go away. Constant daily drumbeat from every single news outlet all day long.
But think how creative the media is with pairing Trump to Russia in all sorts of ridiculous ways that they have.
I mean, they must have to. Every morning they got to think of a new way to repackage the same dog poop that they're putting out there every day. But that is, the ability to pound it in has driven up on the poll numbers, something around 40 to 50% Americans think that there's something there. There must be something there because they can't imagine all of this sort of elite wheels turning and talking about it if it was just totally bogus, right? And yet we have plenty of examples. Iraq has stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, right? I mean, that came out of the intelligence bureaucracy. That was repeated constantly by the mainstream media. There have been a number of lies over the years or falsehoods that have been repeated, things that were incorrect over and over again. And if you just go on the fact, well, everybody's saying it, so it must be true, you would have believed it. But that doesn't make it true. That is simply the power of the liberal commanding heights. That's what we're fighting. And that's what can make so many people, I know those of you listening out there have felt this. I have felt this. There are times when you can feel very isolated, very alone. It feels like, well, the arc of history is bending in their direction. It may not be right. I may not agree with it, but they have all the power. They're making all of the movies and the TV shows, and they write all the academic papers. All the scientific research funding goes to further their goals. And even when we're in power, the bureaucracy is still controlled by the left. So it's like they're permanently in government. I get it. And I feel it. And that's why it's been so frustrating. It's why so many of us were ready for somebody like Trump to come along, right? That ultimately, we're not that interested in his personal life. We're interested in a fighter who wins. And going back to my point about, war is politics without weapons. When you're looking for a general and you're looking for soldiers, you don't go around and say, who's been the nicest person in our village? Let's make him our general. No, you go around and you say, who's the toughest fighter we've got? He may not be the person everybody wants to have dinner with, okay? But if we're going to war, that's the guy I want leading the troops, right? This sort of reframing, which many of us on the Trump train have already come around to, is work we've got to do with other people on the right side of the aisle. People who either voted for Trump and held their nose, which I didn't. I voted for him gleefully. But there are a lot of people out there who are still uncomfortable. They have gotten very used to this Queensberry's rules view of politics, and we have to help them move away from that. Why is the elite media and DC so obsessed with Russia? I mean, let alone the false connections they're making with Trump. Well, why does there seem to be this drumbeat? I mean, look, I consider myself pretty well informed, but in the last 6 months, I have been dumbfounded by this drumbeat to go to war with Russia. This desire by McCain and obviously the military-industrial complex and the elites. I mean, even liberals who, would themselves complain about the military-industrial complex, and they did when it was, focused on Iraq and all that, they beat the drums for war with Russia as well. And it is really, really confounding to me. I have some theories, but I'm not convinced that I have it all figured out. One is you have a lot of, Russia files in DC establishment, a lot of people, holdovers from the Cold War who have studied Russia, know a lot about Russia. They can't take their mind off of Russia because they built their careers on focusing on Russia as an enemy. I think on the left side of the aisle, you have a lot of people that are bitter that Russia is not the vanguard and the flag home of the international socialist movement anymore. When the Russian Revolution came along in 1917, a lot of liberals for a very long time were in love with the Soviet Union. Even when the Stalin purges became known, some still clung to it, but it was because this was the utopia, right? This was an actual country that had adopted communism, and more importantly, there was this Comintern, this whole effort to subvert capitalist countries all over the world, which is what the Cold War was about us fighting that movement to subvert the non-communist countries. I think there are a lot of people on the left that are bitter, still very bitter about the Berlin Wall falling and the Soviet Union dissolving. And I think when they look at Putin, a lot of people on the right look at Putin and see a former KGB agent and they think, it's still the Soviet Union. But I think for the left, it's just the opposite. They're angry that it isn't still the Soviet Union. To the extent that Putin's a bad guy and does bad things, there are at least 40 or 50 other leaders in the world who are just as bad and do the same kinds of things. But the left focuses on Putin because they feel like it's the girlfriend that got away, right? It's not communist anymore, and it's not pushing the communist line, and it's not funding the Comintern, the subversive, all that money flowed into leftist organizations in the United States and in Latin America and South America. The Soviets were funding a lot of left-wing activity for decades. And when the Soviet Union went away, that funding dried up. And it's left a bitter taste in the mouths of a lot of people on the left that there isn't a mothership anymore. Maybe that was the term I was looking for. There's no mothership anymore for communism. And, so that's part of why the environmental movement has taken off, because it's they're trying to build a mothership, a communist mothership out of that. But I think it's a confluence. When you see McCain and people on the left both sort of beating the drums for Russia, they're both angry, but for, I think, different reasons, and really, really focused on Russia in a way that makes very little sense, because Russia's not a threat to us.
No, they're not. And, I don't know why we talk about Russia when we ought to be talking about North Korea.
Well, and yes, and we are talking about North Korea. There's not a lot that we can do. We'll talk more about North Korea, but Trump is right that that China is the solution there. Without China's backing and support, North Korea cannot exist.
Exactly.
And so, I think he's biding his time right now, waiting to see if they'll turn the screws on North Korea over, say, a 12-month period. And I think he reserves the right to go back to, hammering on the Chinese if they don't. He's a very good negotiator. He's a better negotiator than I am. And so, I defer to him. I try to give him some room to run and to not assume that everything that I'm hearing is gospel. You know what I mean? When you're dealing with somebody who's negotiating, who knows why they're saying the things that they are, or why certain things are being leaked, or why certain press releases are put out. That may or may not actually reflect their desires. It may be a negotiating tactic to get a reaction from the other side. The Jerusalem, capital of Israel, is a good example. Why did he sign the 6-month deferral on moving Jerusalem, moving the capital or the embassy to Jerusalem, right? The U.S. Embassy. Well, 6 months puts pressure on the Palestinians, right? They understand that in 6 months he cannot sign the next waiver. So it's not necessarily that he's not fulfilled that promise. It may be that it's a negotiating tactic, right? So we have to give him a little time on that to sort of see how things play out. While we've got some time, I want to talk on just some other things in the news this week. Doris was very happy to learn that they're going to make a Top Gun 2.
If Tom Cruise could just stay young, it would be even better.
When I read that article, I thought it was interesting that Hollywood is so bereft of ideas that they have been cannibalizing all of the most successful TV shows and highest grossing movies of the 1980s and remaking them, recasting them, rebooting them to try to make a buck. And the article said that of all of the top 10 gross movies of the 1980s, there are only 2 that haven't been remade now that Top Gun 2 is in production. One is E.T. and the other is Rain Man.
Well, give him time.
I can't imagine what the Rain Man reboot will look like. So Kathy Griffin beheads the president, sort of mock beheads the president, and the left was a little bit slow on the backlash, but ultimately I think people realized that was a bridge too far. It's amazing. Just another great accomplishment of the president's is the way that he has gotten his opponents to lose their senses, right? What we call the Trump derangement syndrome. Because, and believe me, folks, we want them in the Trump derangement syndrome because they are totally ineffective when they're over the top, when they're doing crazy things, when they cannot control themselves, and there are people on the left who are figuring this out, no one's listening to them. It's driving voters away from them, and it makes them all look mentally unbalanced, which they are. But it's great stuff. I mean, would Mitt Romney have ever driven, them to this? And we all remember Bush derangement syndrome and Reagan derangement syndrome, but Trump's taken it to the 10th power. And they are completely neutered, politically neutered, and completely ineffective because they're so nuts. I mean, CNN has melted down, and their ratings with them. MSNBC's received a bump, but that's just because they are basically the opposition party to the current administration. Republicans are in full control of the government, so Democrats are looking for a place to gather with someone who will vent for them. But CNN thought they had built their brand on neutrality, and they've allowed that brand just to be annihilated.
That's a joke.
So Kathy lost her CNN gig. She's losing sponsors. You thought she did some little quick video where she apologized, and I thought maybe she was going to try to pull the irons out of the fire. But then she has this wacko press conference with her attorney and says the Trump family is bullying her and all of this just craziness. She basically doubled down on her nuts stuff. And, she has taken a big financial hit as a result of just being nuts. Tiger Woods got a DUI. You follow sports a lot more than I do, Doris. What do you think?
I think he's been stopped for that before, but wasn't arrested for the last one until this one. And I just think that the man, with all his back troubles, he's not at a place in life that he expected to be.
He was so disciplined. He had a father, sort of military disciplined him as a young age. He was very, just an incredible golfer. Do you think any of this is, all kind of a confluence of, the money setting him free to not have to be disciplined anymore, being very, very rich, and his father passing away? Do you think all of that is played into it?
I think it's more simple than that. When golf is your whole life and you don't have it anymore, he must be asking himself, what do I have left?
It's hard when you have all of that money for me to feel too sorry for someone, I mean, tough times I get, but, money's a cushion. And money's options, money's choices, or there are a lot of other things you could do that if you have a lot of money, you have the ability to do.
Oh, well, we could go on for an hour alone just on the people who have money who make bad decisions.
True enough. So we had this murder in Portland on the light rail system where this mentally ill guy apparently was harassing some Muslim women and others, and a couple of bystanders stepped in and lost their lives before the cops took this guy into custody. So the left goes, again, this is a great example of the narrative, before anybody knew much, within the first 12 hours, the left jumped on this and used it as, oh, this is Trump's America. This guy was at a Trump rally and did a Nazi salute. So it's, it's all just a Trump supporter. And the truth of it is, of course, that he was a Bernie Sanders supporter. Now, the press had all moved on, so most people don't even know these facts. Those of you on Gab probably do, but he was a Bernie Sanders supporter. Told people on Facebook he couldn't bring himself to vote for Trump as a protest against Hillary. He went to that Trump rally and did that Nazi salute, and the Trump people immediately threw him out, right? And admitted later that he did it just to get attention. Clearly mentally ill. The real story, for those who've ever visited or lived in Portland recently, is that Portland has a massive mental ill population that they allow to roam their streets. Big homeless population, and they don't do anything about it. It's basically a lot like San Francisco. And, if they hadn't been able to tie him to Trump falsely, this would have been a story about the problem they had with the mentally ill. And frankly, all of these same people would have been using him as an excuse to talk about the need for mental health services and the rest. But instead, he was a vehicle for something else, just more hoaxing. Well, we're just about out of time because I want to keep this to about an hour, but I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. I hope you thought it was interesting. We're going to try to do this on a weekly basis. But I want to leave you again with something I said earlier in the show, which is that you are not alone. We are not alone. We may not be a majority, but then the left has never been a majority in this country as well. A vocal minority that's energized and organized can accomplish a great deal. Everything that you see in this country that the left has accomplished over the last 100 years, and they have accomplished a great deal, they did that from a minority position. They did that from a minority position. So, but I want you to know that you're not alone. Everyone who's hearing this, we have to do a better job of organizing and supporting each other, but we have this great historic figure in Trump as someone who we can organize around, and we need to be ready to carry this on when he exits the political stage, which of course will be 8 years from now. But he will not be here forever, and it cannot just be about him. He is a great teacher. He's taught us a lot about how to fight and win, and we need more people who will fight like Trump, and we need to support more people who will fight like Trump, and then we will win more. But again, there's no going back to some time of peace and tranquility. There is no surrender with the left or some compromise in which they're happy. If they're happy, it wasn't a good compromise. Let's make that very clear. We have to understand who we're dealing with. We're further apart than a lot of Americans who aren't politically active want to admit. And there's just no submission. Unless you're willing to let them have the field and let them have their way, which I am not. And it's one of the reasons why I ran for office and served and did what I could, and why I'm doing everything I can to support the President of the United States. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye.